The emergency council session had been going for 16 hours straight, and Admiral Frank Cooper watched the holographic display showing the fall of another Covenant world with grim determination. The Drell swarm had appeared 6 months ago from the galactic rim, and nothing the Covenant threw at them seemed to slow their advance. World after world went dark as the hive-minded species consumed everything in their path and converted it into more ships and more soldiers and more hunger. Helen Price stood beside Frank, studying the tactical data with the analytical mind that had made her the youngest strategic director in human history. Chris Bennett coordinated communications with the scattered Covenant fleets, while Jake Morrison reviewed combat footage from the latest battle, looking for any weakness they could exploit. The situation was desperate and getting worse by the day, because the Covenant had never faced an enemy like this before. The Valine representative Keeper Jaltek spoke with a voice that trembled with suppressed emotion and explained that their defensive doctrines were built on the assumption that all conflicts could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. The Drell did not negotiate, and they did not compromise, and they did not seem to care about their own losses as long as they could continue consuming. 3 species had already been completely wiped out, and 5 more were on the brink of extinction. Frank had been appointed to command the joint military force after the Council had finally admitted that their peaceful methods were not working against an enemy that only understood consumption. He had spent weeks reviewing every battle and every defeat and trying to understand why the Covenant kept losing despite their superior technology. The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable, which was that they had forgotten how to fight, or perhaps had never truly learned in the first place. Helen had identified the core problem, which was that Covenant tactics were designed to minimize casualties on both sides and end conflicts as quickly as possible with minimal destruction. Those tactics worked wonderfully against enemies who also valued life and wanted to avoid losses, but they were suicide against the Drell, who would happily sacrifice 1,000 ships if it meant destroying one enemy vessel. The mathematics of attrition did not favor defenders who valued every life while facing attackers who valued none. Frank presented his plan to the Council and watched their faces as they processed what he was proposing. Guerrilla warfare, and feints and retreats that would draw the Drell into traps and ambushes, and sacrifices of territory and resources to preserve fighting strength for later battles. The Council members looked horrified because everything Frank suggested went against millennia of Covenant philosophy, and some of them argued that winning this way would mean losing who they were as civilizations. Jaltek surprised everyone by supporting Frank's plan, and the Keeper spoke about how the Valine had feared humanity when they first made contact, but now understood that fear could be a teacher. The galaxy had grown soft during its long peace, and the Drell had come to remind them that the universe did not care about philosophy or ideals. Sometimes survival required doing things that hurt the soul, and the only question was whether they were willing to pay that price. The vote was close, but Frank got his authorization, and within days the human approach to warfare began spreading through the Covenant forces. Jake Morrison trained elite units in close-quarters combat and ambush tactics, while Chris Bennett established communication networks that could coordinate hit-and-run attacks across multiple systems. Helen worked with Covenant strategists to identify which worlds could be defended and which would have to be evacuated and abandoned to the swarm. The first test came at a mining colony on the edge of Covenant space, where Frank deliberately let the Drell think they had an easy target. The colony was evacuated except for military personnel, and when the swarm arrived in force, they found fortified positions and prepared defenders, and a fleet waiting in ambush behind the system's gas giant. The battle was brutal, and humans died alongside their alien comrades, but when it was over, the Drell had lost more ships than they had in any previous engagement. Frank stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the cleanup operations and tried not to think about the names and faces of the people who would not be coming home. Beside him, Helen compiled casualty reports with steady hands, even though he could see the pain in her eyes. Chris coordinated the withdrawal of surviving forces while Jake debriefed the combat teams and identified lessons for next time. This was what war looked like when you fought to win, instead of fighting to minimize harm. The Council praised the victory, but Frank could hear the uncertainty in their voices because they were starting to understand what it meant to wage the kind of war humans knew too well. The Covenant species had lived in peace for so long that they had forgotten that sometimes peace had to be fought for, and defended, and purchased with blood. Frank tried to explain that humans did not enjoy this, and that every loss hurt them as much as it hurt anyone else, but that they had learned to function through the pain. The Drell responded to their defeat by intensifying their attacks, and the war entered a new phase where both sides were learning from each other. Frank established defensive lines and fallback positions, and began the slow grinding work of bleeding the swarm until they could not sustain their advance. Helen calculated acceptable loss rates and tried not to feel sick when she realized she was treating lives as numbers on a spreadsheet. Chris worked 18-hour days coordinating the logistics of a war that spanned dozens of star systems. Jake led a mission to rescue civilians from a Tellan colony world that was under Drell assault, and the operation became a legend among the Covenant forces. He held the line with just 50 soldiers while evacuation ships loaded thousands of refugees, and when reinforcements finally arrived, they found Jake and his team still fighting, even though they were wounded and exhausted, and down to their last ammunition. The Tellan people erected a monument to those human soldiers, and Jake tried to explain that he had just been doing his job, but they insisted on treating him like a hero. The turning point came at the Battle of Meridian's Edge, where Frank faced the largest Drell fleet yet assembled and knew that if he lost this engagement, the war would be effectively over. Helen had developed a plan that required sacrificing 3 capital ships to destroy the swarm's command vessel, and Frank had approved it, even though he knew hundreds of crew members would die. The volunteers had stepped forward without hesitation, and Frank had shaken each of their hands and tried to find words adequate to their sacrifice. The battle lasted 9 hours and was the most intense fighting the Covenant had ever witnessed. The 3 volunteer ships rammed the Drell command vessel at full speed while the rest of the fleet concentrated fire on the resulting chaos. Chris coordinated the attack with precision timing, while Jake led boarding parties to capture Drell vessels for intelligence purposes. Helen monitored the entire battlefield and adjusted the plan in real time as conditions changed. When the Drell command vessel exploded, the entire swarm fleet faltered as individual ships lost coordination and began making tactical errors. Frank ordered an immediate full assault, and the Covenant forces tore into the confused enemy with a savagery that surprised even themselves. The Drell retreated for the first time since the war began, and left behind the wreckage of hundreds of ships. Frank attended the memorial service for the volunteers who had sacrificed themselves and tried to speak about courage and duty, but his voice broke halfway through and he had to stop. Helen finished the speech for him and talked about how those crew members had known exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway because they believed in something larger than themselves. The Covenant representatives who attended the service wept openly, and Frank realized they were finally beginning to understand what humans had known all along. In the weeks that followed, the momentum of the war shifted, and the Drell found themselves on the defensive as Covenant forces used human tactics to devastating effect. Frank pushed his fleets hard and accepted losses that made him wake up screaming in the middle of the night, but he also won battle after battle. Helen developed new strategies that combined human aggression with Covenant technology, and the results were better than either species could have achieved alone. Chris kept the entire war machine running smoothly, while Jake trained more soldiers in the brutal reality of combat. Jaltek came to visit Frank on his flagship, and the two of them stood looking at the tactical displays in silence for a long time. Finally, the Keeper spoke and said that the Valine now understood both why humanity had survived on Earth and why they had been right to fear them during first contact. Frank asked if that fear had turned to hate, and Jaltek surprised him by saying it had turned to respect and gratitude, and the recognition that sometimes the galaxy needed people who knew how to fight. Frank thought about Earth and about the long history of human warfare and about all the terrible things his species had done to each other over the millennia. He thought about how that same capacity for violence was now saving alien civilizations who had never learned to defend themselves. He wondered if that made humanity's violent past somehow justified, or if it just meant that evil could sometimes be turned toward. The ship called Horizon cut through the darkness between stars like a knife through silk, and Captain Daniel Wright stood on the bridge watching the unknown unfold before him. They had left Earth 6 months ago, and now they were farther from home than any human had ever traveled, and the weight of that distance pressed on Daniel's shoulders like a physical thing. Behind him, the pilot Lisa Morgan adjusted their course with steady hands, while Kevin Blake monitored the engines from his station, and Amanda Foster studied the readings from their long-range sensors with the intense focus she brought to everything. The year was 2187, and humanity had finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel after decades of failed attempts and breakthrough discoveries, and now they were here in the Kepler 442 system, where their instruments had detected signs of something impossible, life in not just simple microbes but technology and civilization, and the possibility that humanity was not alone in the universe after all. Daniel had been a pilot before he became a captain, and he had flown missions to Mars and the outer planets. But nothing had prepared him for this moment when the sensors began to scream with contact alerts, and Lisa's voice cut through the bridge with sharp precision. Something was approaching them, and it was big, and it was moving with purpose and intention that made Daniel's heart beat faster in his chest. The view screen flickered to life and showed them what was coming, and Daniel felt his breath catch because it was beautiful and terrible all at once. The ship was made of something that looked like crystal or glass, and it moved through space without any visible engines or thrusters, and it was easily 10 times the size of the horizon. Kevin swore softly at his station, and Amanda leaned forward, with her eyes wide, and Lisa's hands moved to the weapon controls without anyone telling her to do it. Daniel raised his hand to stop her because this was the moment that would define everything that came after, and he knew that if they fired first, then humanity would be starting its relationship with the stars on the wrong foot. He opened a communications channel and spoke into the void with words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was happening, but they were all he had. The response came in perfect English, and that shocked them almost as much as the ship itself because the voice that spoke to them had clearly studied humanity before making contact. The being introduced itself as Keeper Jaltek of the Valine people, and it welcomed them to the wider galaxy, with words that were both friendly and cautious. Daniel responded with all the diplomatic training he had received before the mission, and tried to keep his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking. Jaltek invited them aboard the Valine vessel, and after a brief discussion with his crew, Daniel agreed because they had come all this way to meet whoever was out here, and turning back now would be admitting defeat. Lisa piloted the Horizon into the docking bay of the crystal ship, and they prepared to meet the aliens face to face for the first time in human history. The Valine were tall and slender, with skin that seemed to shimmer with inner light, and their movements were graceful in a way that made Daniel think of dancers or flowing water. Jaltek stood waiting for them in the docking bay, and when the human crew emerged from their ship, the keeper studied them with eyes that were too large and too knowing. Amanda stepped forward first because she was the xenobiologist, and this was what she had trained her whole life to do, and she extended her hand in the universal human gesture of greeting. Jaltek looked at the hand for a moment before reaching out to take it, and the touch was warm despite the crystalline appearance of the keeper's skin. They were led through corridors that seemed to be alive with light and into a chamber where other Valine waited, and Daniel realized they were being evaluated and judged, and that everything humanity did in the next few hours would shape their future among the stars. The keeper explained that they were part of something called the Covenant of Civilized Worlds, and that 47 different species had joined together to maintain peace and order across this region of the galaxy. They had rules and protocols, and ways of doing things that had been established over thousands of years, and humanity would need to learn them all if they wanted to join. Daniel listened and nodded and tried to absorb the overwhelming flood of information, while his crew stood beside him and tried to do the same. Then Jaltek asked about Earth and about humanity's history, and Daniel told the truth because lying seemed pointless when dealing with beings who could cross the stars. He talked about the wars and the conflicts and the endless cycles of violence that had marked human civilization from its beginning to its present. He talked about nuclear weapons and world wars, and the near extinctions that humanity had barely survived, and with each word he spoke he watched the Valine's expressions change. What he saw in their faces was not disgust or anger, but something else entirely, and it took Daniel several minutes to recognize it for what it was. Fear, and not the fear of immediate danger, but the deeper fear that comes from understanding something alien and powerful and unpredictable. The Valine had mastered interstellar travel 3,000 years ago, but they had done it without ever fighting a major war, and they had never developed weapons of mass destruction because their evolution had taken a different path than humanity's. Kevin noticed it too, and he leaned close to Daniel and whispered that the aliens were scared of them, and Daniel realized it was true. The Valine had welcomed them with curiosity, but now that they understood what humanity was and what they were capable of, that curiosity had transformed into wariness. Amanda tried to explain that humans were not monsters and that they had also created art and music and literature and all the beautiful things that made civilization worthwhile, but her words seemed to fall flat. Jaltec composed itself and explained that the Covenant would need time to discuss humanity's application for membership, and that there would be tests and trials to determine if they were suitable for integration into galactic society. Daniel agreed because what choice did he have? And the meeting ended with polite words and formal gestures that could not hide the underlying tension. Back on the horizon, the crew gathered in the common room and tried to process what had just happened. Lisa poured coffee for everyone because some human rituals were too important to abandon even in the depths of space, and they sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, Kevin spoke and said what they were all thinking, which was that the galaxy's first impression of humanity was not what they had hoped for. Daniel stared at his coffee and thought about all the years of preparation and training and dreaming that had led to this moment, and how it had all come down to the simple fact that humans knew how to kill each other better than most species knew how to defend themselves. He wondered if that made them monsters or survivors, and whether the galaxy would ever be able to see them as both. Amanda said that maybe it was not such a bad thing to be feared, and that respect often grew from fear, and that humanity had survived this long by being underestimated by their enemies and overestimated by their friends. Lisa agreed and added that the Valine might be scared now, but they would learn that humans could be trusted, and that fear could transform into friendship given time. Daniel wanted to believe them, but he kept seeing the look in Jaltec's eyes. When the Keeper had understood what humanity truly was, and he knew that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. The stars had learned that humans existed, and with that knowledge had come the realization that the galaxy was no longer quite as safe as it had been before. Humanity had taken flight, and the universe would never be the same. 6 months had passed since the Horizon's first contact with the Valine, and Commander Nicole Hayes stood in the observation deck of the transport ship, watching Station Harmony grow larger in the viewport. The station was a marvel of engineering that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, and it hung in space like a jewel catching the light of 3 nearby stars. Beside her, Greg Palmer checked his tactical display for the 100th time, while Sophie Turner reviewed her notes on Covenant protocols and customs. They were the diplomatic mission sent to prove that humanity deserved a place in the Covenant of civilized worlds, and Nicole felt the weight of billions of people resting on her shoulders. The Covenant had granted humanity provisional membership after months of debate and discussion, but the decision had been controversial, and many species still questioned whether humans could be trusted. Nicole understood their concerns because she had read the reports and knew exactly what the Valine had told the other species about Earth's violent history. The docking procedure was smooth and efficient, and within minutes they were walking through the station's main concourse, surrounded by aliens of every shape and size imaginable. Sophie identified each species as they passed and shared what little information humanity had gathered about them. The insectoid Kresh, who communicated through chemical signals, and the floating Aryl, who had evolved in gas giant atmospheres, and the four-armed Telon, who seemed perpetually surprised by everything they saw. Greg kept his hand near his sidearm, out of habit, and Nicole had to remind him that they were diplomats now and not soldiers, but old instincts died hard. He had served in the Earth Defense Force before joining the diplomatic corps, and he still moved like a man expecting trouble around every corner. Nicole could not blame him, because she felt it too, and that constant readiness that came from growing up on a world where danger was never far away. They were assigned quarters in the human section of the station, and given 3 days to acclimate before their official duties began. Nicole used the time to study everything she could about the Covenant's structure and history, while Greg mapped out the station's security systems and Sophie practiced her pronunciation of alien names. On the 3rd day, they received word that they would be attending a council session where several disputes between member species would be mediated and resolved. The council chamber was enormous and filled with representatives from all 47. member species, and Nicole felt small and out of place among beings who had been crossing the stars since before humanity had invented writing. The session began with formal introductions, and then moved into the first dispute, which involved trade routes between the Valine and the Kresh. Nicole listened carefully and tried to understand the nuances of galactic politics, but it was like learning a new language where every word had multiple meanings. The second dispute was more heated and involved territorial boundaries between two species, whose names Sophie had to whisper to Nicole because she could not keep track of everyone yet. The debate went back and forth for hours, with each side presenting evidence and arguments while the council mediators tried to find common ground. Nicole noticed that no one raised their voice or made threats, and that all disagreements were handled with calm rationality that seemed almost unnatural to her human sensibilities. That was when the alarm started blaring and red lights flooded the chamber, and a voice announced in multiple languages that the station was under attack. The council members looked at each other in confusion, and then slowly began to move toward the exits while security forces rushed in to escort them to safety. Nicole grabbed Greg and Sophie and pulled them toward the nearest emergency station, because her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Greg accessed the security network using his diplomatic credentials and pulled up the tactical display, and what he saw made his face go pale. 3 ships had appeared out of nowhere and were firing on the station's outer sections, while small craft deployed boarding parties at multiple docking points. Sophie identified the attackers as the Kryn and explained that they were a militant species that had been rejected by the Covenant decades ago for their aggressive expansion policies. The station's defense forces were responding, but their tactics seemed confused and uncoordinated, and Nicole watched in frustration as security teams walked into ambushes and failed to establish proper defensive perimeters. She looked at Greg and saw the same thought reflected in his eyes, which was that they could do better than this if someone would just let them help. Sophie was already accessing the communication systems and trying to reach the defense coordinator. When they finally got through to the Talon officer in charge of security, Nicole tried to offer assistance but was politely told that the situation was under control and that civilians should remain in their quarters. She watched the tactical display and saw defense teams getting cut down by Kryn boarders, and knew that the situation was anything but controlled. Greg muttered something about bureaucracy and started planning an unauthorized response. Nicole made a decision that would either save lives or end her diplomatic career, and she gave Greg permission to do what needed to be done. He moved with the speed and efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation, and within minutes he had organized a group of human technicians and support staff into an improvised security team. Sophie stayed with Nicole and began coordinating with the scattered defense forces, while Nicole herself started implementing tactics that the Covenant had never seen before. The Kryn boarders were expecting the same passive resistance they had encountered in previous raids, but instead they found humans who fought with aggressive precision. Greg led his team in a flanking maneuver that caught the Kryn by surprise, and Sophie directed the Covenant security forces into positions where they could provide supporting fire without exposing themselves. Nicole coordinated everything from the command center she had appropriated and barked orders in 3 different languages. The battle lasted for 2 hours, and by the end the Kryn had been pushed back to their boarding craft and forced to retreat with heavy losses. The station's defense forces had suffered minimal casualties thanks to the human intervention, and the council members emerged from their shelters to find that the crisis had been resolved. Nicole stood in the command center surrounded by tactical displays and exhausted security personnel, and waited for the consequences of her actions. The Teln defense coordinator arrived first, and Nicole prepared herself for a reprimand, but instead, the officer thanked her with genuine gratitude in its 4 eyes. Other species representatives began arriving and asking questions about human tactics and strategies, and Nicole found herself giving an impromptu lecture on defensive operations, while Greg demonstrated proper security protocols. Sophie fielded questions about human military history, and tried to explain concepts like aggressive defense and acceptable risk. In the days that followed, Nicole and her team were both praised and criticized in equal measure. Some species saw them as heroes who had saved lives, while others saw them as dangerous wildcards who had ignored proper procedures. The human delegation was invited to help restructure the station's security systems, and Greg found himself training Covenant security forces in tactics they had never considered necessary before. Nicole attended a private meeting with several senior council members, where she was asked to explain why humans had responded so differently than other species would have. She tried to find the right words to describe how growing up on Earth taught you to always be ready for the worst because the worst had a habit of finding you whether you were ready or not. She talked about how human children learned to assess threats and plan escapes and fight back when necessary, because those instincts had kept their species alive for millions of years. One of the council members asked if humans were always so quick to resort to violence, and Nicole had to think carefully before answering. She explained that humans did not seek out violence, but they also did not shy away from it when it was necessary, and that there was a difference between aggression and defense that sometimes got lost in translation. She said that humans had learned, through painful experience, that hesitation could cost lives, and that sometimes the best way to preserve peace was to be ready for war. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but Nicole could see that she had given the council members something to think about. Greg reported that the security training was going well, despite some cultural misunderstandings, and Sophie said that public opinion on the station was slowly shifting from fear to cautious respect. Nicole wrote her report for Earth and tried to capture everything that had happened, but words felt inadequate for describing how it felt to be the bridge between two completely different ways of understanding the universe. That night, Nicole stood in the observation deck again and watched the stars and thought about what it meant to be human among aliens who had never known war. She wondered if humanity would change the Covenant, or if the Covenant would change humanity, or if somehow they would meet somewhere in the middle. She thought about the Kryn boarders, who had expected easy prey and found humans instead, and she felt something that might have been pride or might have been sadness. Colonel Ryan Foster watched the Kresh soldier break down crying during the combat simulation and felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. The training facility on Station Harmony had been converted into what humans would recognize as a military academy, and Ryan was responsible for teaching alien species how to fight a war they had never wanted. Beside him, Dr. Laura Mills made notes on the psychological impact, while Patrick Stone reset the simulation parameters for another run. The war against the Drell swarm had been going on for 18 months now, and while humanity's tactics had turned, the tide they had also revealed a fundamental problem. The Covenant species were not psychologically prepared for the kind of sustained violence that modern warfare required. Soldiers froze in combat or made decisions based on minimizing harm rather than achieving objectives, and the casualty rates among non-human forces remained unacceptably high. Laura had been brought in to develop psychological screening and support programs for Covenant military personnel, and what she discovered disturbed her deeply. Most species in the Covenant had evolved on worlds with fewer predators and less environmental danger than Earth. They had never developed the same fight-or-flight responses that humans took for granted, and their brains simply were not wired to process extreme violence as anything other than traumatic aberration. Ryan ran the simulation again with adjusted parameters and watched as the Kresh soldier performed marginally better, but still hesitated at critical moments. Patrick suggested lowering the difficulty, but Ryan shook his head because the real Drell would not be easier, and training that did not prepare soldiers for actual combat conditions was worse than useless. Laura intervened and proposed a different approach that focused on building psychological resilience before increasing tactical complexity. Across the station, Captain Amy Richardson led her strike team through another successful mission against a Drell supply line and returned to base with 0 casualties for the 7th consecutive operation. She debriefed her mixed human and alien squad and praised their performance, but Ryan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Amy had been fighting since the war began, and she had seen things that would break most people, but she kept going back out because someone had to do it. Ryan met with Amy in the officers' mess and asked her how she kept functioning after so many months of combat, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not really know. She said that humans seemed to have this ability to compartmentalize trauma and keep functioning even when their minds were screaming at them to stop. She described it as putting the pain in a box and promising yourself you would deal with it later, and then just hoping later never came. Laura joined their conversation and explained that what Amy was describing was a survival mechanism that humans had developed over millions of years of dangerous evolution. She said that most Covenant species did not have the same mechanism because they had never needed it, and that trying to teach them to be like humans might be causing more harm than good. The question was whether it was possible to prepare beings for war, when their entire psychology was built around avoiding exactly that kind of stress. Patrick brought data showing that mixed squads with human leaders performed significantly better than pure Covenant units, and Ryan studied the numbers trying to understand what that meant. It suggested that alien soldiers could function in combat if they had human examples to follow. But the implications of that were troubling. It meant that the Covenant had become dependent on humanity, not just for tactical expertise, but for the psychological ability to engage in sustained warfare. The breaking point came when the Drell launched a massive assault on Valine Prime, and the crystalline homeworld found itself under direct attack for the first time in its recorded history. Ryan received emergency orders to deploy with every available combat team, and he found himself coordinating the defense of an alien world while the Valine people watched their peaceful civilization burn. Keeper Jaltek stood beside Ryan in the command center, and the ancient being's crystalline face reflected the fires below. Commander Jack Peterson led the naval defense, and his tactics were aggressive to the point of recklessness as he threw his fleet into the teeth of the Drell assault. Ryan watched the tactical displays and saw human ships taking damage that would make any sane commander retreat. But Jack kept pushing forward because retreat meant abandoning millions of Valine civilians to certain death. Laura monitored the psychological state of the defending forces and saw stress indicators that would normally require immediate evacuation. But there was nowhere to evacuate to. The battle raged for 3 days, and Ryan did not sleep once during that entire time, because he was coordinating ground forces and orbital defenses and evacuation efforts all simultaneously. Amy led strike teams against Drell landing parties and fought building to building through Valine cities that had never seen violence in their 1,000-year histories. Patrick managed logistics and kept ammunition and medical supplies flowing to forces that were burning through resources at unsustainable rates. Jack lost half his fleet saving the orbital defense platforms, but he counted it as an acceptable trade, because those platforms were the only thing keeping the Drell from landing reinforcements. His ship took damage that should have destroyed it, but somehow the crew kept it functional, through sheer determination and improvisation. When the Drell finally retreated, Jack's flagship was little more than a floating wreck, but it was still firing. The aftermath was devastating because even though they had won the defense of Valine Prime, the cost had been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Valine had died, and their cities lay in ruins, and their people were traumatized in ways they had no cultural context to understand. Ryan walked through the destroyed districts and tried to help with recovery efforts, but everywhere he went, he saw the same haunted look in alien eyes. Jaltek found Ryan sitting in the rubble of what had been a school, and the keeper sat down beside him without speaking for a long time. Finally, Jaltek said that the Valine now understood what humans had tried to explain about the nature of war and the price of survival. The keeper said that they had been wrong to judge humanity for their violent history because they had never faced the kind of existential threat that forged such a species. Ryan tried to explain that this was exactly what humans had been trying to avoid, and that bringing war to the Covenant had never been their intention. He said that humans knew the cost of violence better than anyone, and that they carried those costs with them every day. Jaltek listened and then said something that Ryan would remember for the rest of his life, which was that perhaps humanity's greatest strength was not their ability to fight, but their ability to keep fighting even when they knew the price. Laura conducted psychological evaluations of the surviving defenders and found that the human personnel were coping better than expected, while the Covenant soldiers were struggling with symptoms that looked like severe PTSD. She developed intervention protocols and brought in counselors, but the fundamental problem remained that most species simply were not built to process this kind of trauma. Amy sat in on some of the sessions and tried to explain how humans dealt with combat stress, but found that her coping mechanisms did not translate well to alien psychology. Lieutenant Melissa Carter started questioning whether they were losing, something essential in the pursuit of victory, and she spoke to Ryan about her concerns. She said that she had joined the military to protect people, but lately she felt more like a weapon that was pointed at enemies and fired without much thought for the consequences. She talked about the Drell they had killed and wondered if the swarm was truly mindless or if they were just different in ways humans did not understand. Ryan had no good answers for Melissa because he struggled with the same questions himself. He introduced her to Brandon Lewis, who worked in supply coordination and had developed his own philosophy about the ethics of warfare. Brandon said that war was never good, but sometimes it was necessary, and that the measure of a person was not whether they could avoid violence, but whether they could use violence in defense of something worthwhile and still remain human afterward. Dr. Claire Jensen ran the medical facilities, and she saw the physical and psychological wounds up close every day. She told Ryan that humans were breaking under the strain too, even if they were better at hiding it. She said that every soldier who came through her medbay carried scars that would never fully heal, and that eventually there would be a reckoning for all the trauma they were accumulating. She asked how long humans could sustain this level of combat before they lost themselves entirely. Ryan organized a memorial service for all the fallen, and both human and Covenant attended in numbers that overwhelmed the available space. He spoke about sacrifice and duty and the cost of freedom, but the words felt hollow compared to the reality of what they had all endured. Amy stood beside him, and when he faltered, she took over and spoke about how the dead would want the living to remember them, but also to keep living and not let grief consume them entirely. Jaltek addressed the crowd and said that the Covenant had learned a terrible lesson, which was that peace could not be taken for granted, and that sometimes it had to be defended with force. Fleet Admiral Daniel Wright stood before the holographic display showing the Drell Corps and knew that this would be his last battle one way or another. 2 years of war had brought them to this moment where humanity and the Covenant would either break the swarm forever or die trying. Behind him, Vice Admiral Nicole Hayes coordinated fleet positions, while Strategic Director Greg Palmer finalized the assault plan, and Chief Coordinator Sophie Turner managed communications with 47 different species, all preparing for the most dangerous operation in galactic history. The plan was ambitious to the point of madness, which meant it was perfectly suited to human thinking. A frontal assault by the main fleet would draw Drell forces into defensive positions, while infiltration teams led by veterans like Jake Morrison would disable critical infrastructure from within. Diversionary attacks at 3 other locations would split swarm attention, while the real killing blow came from an unconventional angle that Covenant strategists had initially dismissed as suicidal. Daniel had argued for the plan because he understood something the Covenant was still learning, which was that sometimes you had to risk everything to win. Greg had refined the tactics, and Nicole had convinced the other fleet commanders to go along with it, and Sophie had somehow managed to coordinate the logistics of moving hundreds of ships into position without alerting the Drell. Now all that remained was to execute and hope that their calculations were correct. The fleet consisted of vessels from every Covenant species alongside human warships that had been built specifically for this campaign. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded a squadron of fast attack craft, while Kevin Blake led the engineering teams that would keep damaged ships operational during the battle. Amanda Foster had analyzed Drell biology and identified weaknesses that could be exploited if they could get close enough to the hive structures. Daniel gave the order to begin and watched as the first wave of ships dropped out of FTL directly into Drell space and immediately came under fire from defensive installations. The plan called for acceptable losses during this phase, and Daniel tried not to think about the crews who would not make it through the next few hours. Nicole coordinated evasive maneuvers, while Greg identified priority targets, and Sophie relayed tactical updates to the scattered fleet elements. Lisa led her squadron in a high-speed run through Drell fighter screens, and her flying was spectacular to watch as she threaded between enemy ships with centimeters to spare. Kevin kept his carrier's engines running at dangerous levels because they needed maximum power for the maneuvers Nicole was calling for. Amanda monitored the Drell response patterns and confirmed that they were reacting exactly as predicted, which meant the diversionary attacks were working. The infiltration teams launched from hidden positions, and Jake Morrison led the main assault against the Drell central hive structure. His team included veterans from a dozen species, all trained in human combat tactics, and all volunteers who knew the odds of survival were minimal. They breached the hive's outer shell using explosives designed by human engineers and fought their way through corridors that pulsed with alien biology. Daniel watched the tactical display and saw ships dying on both sides as the battle intensified, but the Drell were committed now and pulling forces from other regions to defend their core. Greg confirmed that the diversionary fleets were under heavy attack, which meant the trap was working. Sophie struggled to maintain communications as jamming increased, but she kept the network operational through sheer determination and creative rooting. The second phase began when human battleships armed with prototype weapons moved into firing position and began targeting the massive biostructures that served as the swarm's coordination centers. The weapons had been developed using knowledge gained from 2 years of studying captured Drell vessels, and they were specifically designed to disrupt the hive mind connections. Amanda had warned that the effects would be unpredictable, and she was right, because as the first structures exploded, the entire Drell fleet began exhibiting erratic behavior. Nicole saw the opening and ordered an immediate assault on the confused enemy formations. Fleet commanders who had initially questioned human tactics now executed them with precision as Covenant ships tore into the disorganized Drell forces. Daniel felt a fierce pride watching alien species who had known only peace 2 years ago, fighting with the skill and determination that humans had helped them develop. Lisa's squadron took heavy casualties during a run against a Drell command ship, but they succeeded in destroying it, and the loss of coordination caused an entire sector of the enemy fleet to collapse. Kevin's carrier suffered critical damage, but he managed to keep it functional long enough to launch a final fighter wave before ordering evacuation. Amanda identified a weakness in the central hive structure and transmitted the information to Jake's infiltration team, who were fighting their way toward that exact location. Jake and his team reached the core of the hive after losing more than half their members to Drell defenders and internal security systems. What they found was beyond anything they had expected, which was a massive biological computer that coordinated billions of Drell across dozens of star systems. Jake placed the charges himself because he knew that someone had to take responsibility, and he refused to ask anyone else to do what he was unwilling to do. The explosion that followed was visible across half the battlefield as the central hive structure detonated and sent shockwaves through the Drell network. Every swarm ship suddenly lost coordination and began operating independently, which meant they could no longer execute complex tactics or coordinate fleet movements. Daniel ordered the full assault, and the Covenant forces crashed into the confused enemy with devastating effect. Greg monitored the battle and called targets for the fleet commanders while Sophie kept communications flowing, despite increasing system failures. Nicole coordinated 1,000 ships moving in concert, and her tactical brilliance turned what could have been chaos into a perfectly executed assault. The Drell fought back with desperate ferocity, but they were no longer fighting as a unified swarm, and that made all the difference. The battle raged for 3 days, and by the end, the Drell core lay in ruins, and the swarm was broken into scattered fragments that no longer posed an existential threat. Daniel stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the cleanup operations and tried to process what they had accomplished. The cost had been staggering, with thousands of ships destroyed and tens of thousands of personnel lost, but they had won. Lisa survived her squadron's destruction by pure luck and skill, and when she finally docked with the carrier, she collapsed from exhaustion. Kevin made it off his dying ship with minutes to spare and was already planning upgrades for the next generation of carriers before the medics finished treating his injuries. Amanda compiled reports on Drell biology and wondered if there had been any other way to stop them, but concluded that probably there had not been. Jake Morrison was listed as missing in action and presumed dead after the hive structure explosion, but 3 days later a rescue team found him and 2 other survivors in an escape pod, drifting in space. He was unconscious and barely alive, but when he woke up in the medical bay, the first thing he asked was whether they had won. Daniel visited him personally and told him that yes, they had won, and that Jake's sacrifice had made the difference. The Covenant assembled at Station Harmony for a memorial ceremony that lasted an entire week as they honored the fallen from all 47 species, plus humanity. Daniel stood with other survivors and listened as Keeper Jaltek spoke about courage and sacrifice and the bonds that had been forged through shared hardship. The Valine had erected a monument that listed every name of every person who had died in the war, and it stretched for kilometers. Jaltek addressed the assembled civilizations and acknowledged that humanity had changed the Covenant in fundamental ways. The Keeper said that 2 years ago the galaxy had learned to fear humans, but now they understood that humanity's capacity for violence came from the same source as their capacity for loyalty and protection. Humans fought not because they loved war, but because they refused to let others suffer what they had endured throughout their history. Daniel was asked to speak, and he stood before representatives of species from across the galaxy and tried to find words adequate to the moment. He talked about how humans had come to the stars seeking connection and discovery and had instead found themselves teaching the galaxy how to wage war. He said that humanity took no pride in this and that every human soldier carried the weight of what they had done. He acknowledged that humans had brought fear back to the stars, but he hoped they had also brought something else. He spoke about the young pilot who had flown impossible missions and survived through skill and determination. He spoke about the engineer who had kept ships running past the point where physics said they should fail. He spoke about the scientist who had turned her knowledge towards saving lives instead of taking them. He spoke about the soldier who had walked into certain death so that others might live. He said that these people represented what humanity was at its core, which was beings who refused to give up no matter how dark things became. Nicole stood beside Daniel, and when he faltered, she continued the